Azure Policy is one of the most powerful tools in Azure. It powers the Azure Advisor, Defender for Cloud, regulatory compliance dashboards, AMBA or Azure Monitor Baseline Alerts, and even the entire Azure Landing Zone architecture, what we used to refer to as enterprise scale. In other words, if you understand Azure Policy, you understand how Azure enforces control at scale. But here's the thing, if you can go one step further and automate it with Terraform, you'll not only save countless hours, but instantly you will level up your cloud engineering skills. So in this video, we'll answer what can we actually do with Azure Policy? What makes up a policy definition and an assignment? And how do we create and automate all of this with Terraform? So first off, let's actually break down what is the anatomy of an Azure policy. You have a policy definition, which is a JSON object that defines how this policy should work. Think of the XML files that used to power the group policies and how they should work. But the group policies themselves, as well as the policy definitions themselves, they don't do much. They just tell us how it's supposed to work. That is when we go to what's called a policy assignment. And this is the functionality that is actually going to make some difference, because this is what's going to enforce controls, deny certain things from happening, or update resources and make sure that they follow suit, basically what the policy definition explains to us what it should do. And we will break down the policy definition more, but just know that you take this policy assignment and then you place this on an Azure subscription, for example. Azure Policy inherits downwards. In the example here, you can see if you place it at the subscription level, the resource groups and the resources within them will be affected by this policy. So now that you understand what a policy definition is, there is actually something else that we have to take into account as well, which you will stumble upon, which is there is a thing called policy initiative. A policy initiative is basically a collection of policy definitions. So a policy initiative is one or more policy definitions, usually controlling the same type of things. So in this example, we have a huge policy initiative, which is enforcing private link on resources, and then it contains the individual policy definitions for private link on storage or on SQL or service bus. A common thing you will see with this as well is a policy initiative for audit logs, and then you can have audit logs for specific resources. But let's actually have a look at a policy definition and see what it actually contains. We can do this by coming to the Azure portal. We can go to policy, and then here in the left here you have the definitions. You got your assignments. This is a new one, which wasn't here when I was recording yesterday, but it is here now. Machine configuration, exciting stuff. And then we have exemptions. So you can assign a policy and then you can exempt certain resources because of reasons. But let's actually go into a definition, and a pretty common one that we use when explaining this to fairly beginners of Azure Policy is we look at a policy called allowed locations. Basically does what it says. It's gonna control and govern what locations can you deploy resources into. Perhaps you are based in Europe and you don't want anyone deploying anything into East US. So then we have the basic definition, and we can see the JSON file here, and it contains a few key things. So first of all, you can see it is a JSON file. It has the JSON format, and we can look at certain things. So it has certain properties like the display name, which we saw. It contains a policy type. So right now we are looking at a built-in policy, and basically you will have the built-in policies, but then if you create policies yourself, the other policy type will be set to custom, which by the way we will do later in this video. Mode is currently set to indexed for this policy. So basically what mode means is you can have index and you can have all. So think of it like this. If a resource has support for tags, it's going to be affected by any policy that is the mode indexed. So you can think about, for example, a route table. A route table itself is a resource that you can apply a tag on. However, when you create a route on the route table, the route itself doesn't support tags. So the route itself is not going to be affected by the policy. That's basically what you need to know about the indexed mode. Then you have a description, basically a longer format descriptor of what the definition actually entails. It contains some metadata, some version, what category. But then we get into the fun stuff. So we have some parameters. In this case, we have one parameter. It's called list of allowed locations. It is a type of array. It could be a string, it could be a number, like when you define variables in Terraform, for example, you can define what the variable is. Some more metadata about the parameter if you want to. And by the way, when we create these ourselves, like everything in here isn't mandatory, but this is what they usually contain when you look at least the built-in ones. And then we have the policy rule, basically the thing that says that if you apply me as I am, I'm gonna enforce what is inside the policy rule block. I don't know if that makes sense, but let's just have a look at it. So basically in here you can say that if all of the location is not in the list of allowed location parameter. So assume that our list of allowed location is only Sweden Central, but you have supplied, when you created your resource, you have supplied, for example, North Europe. It's going to check this. It is also going to check that the location doesn't equal global, because some resources that aren't like directly tied to a region that way. Some resources are global. I believe like private DNS zones can be global, or front doors. Don't quote me on this, but there are resources that are global. And the last check is we want to make sure that the type does not equal B2C directories. For some reason they have to do this, because I'm assuming the policy doesn't work the way it's intended to. Maybe B2C directories are weird when it comes to the location, or doesn't have a location, or it's automatically tied to the tenant location. Like, I have no idea, but that's just a flavor of it. However, if we hit everything in here, then apply the effect. Right here, it's hard-coded to be deny. It is very common to come up here and have a parameter called effect. And then you would be able to assign different types of effects to this policy. And by the way, when we're talking about effects, this is something that is very key to understand when working with Azure Policy. So the most common ones that we're going to stumble upon are audit and audit if it doesn't exist. And these are things where if you apply a policy and the policy rule does its calculations and it feels like the resource is not up to par with what the policy rule says, then the policy is going to be marked as non-compliant, but nothing actually happens to the resource itself. It'll just be non-compliant. Then you have another pretty common one that is deny, and that's basically whenever you create or update an existing resource, Azure Policy is going to evaluate the resource, and if you are in conflict with the policy, the change or the deployment that you're trying to do is not going to go through. It's going to get denied. Another one is deploy if not exists, and contrary to how audit if not exists works, it's basically if you have a resource and it's being updated or created and it doesn't match what the policy wants you to achieve, it's basically going to make a deployment for you, and it's going to create a new deployment resource. It's going to run a deployment against that, and it's going to make sure to remediate and update the resource so it is in compliance. And then you have modify, which is very similar to deploy if not exist, but it like changes existing resources to make sure that they follow suit to whatever the policy says. There are more effects, and some of the effects are very similar to one another. And the one we're looking at right now, it makes sense to just have the deny effect, because if you're trying to create something in a location we don't allow, we just want to deny you. However, a use case for deploy if not exists, for example, could be that we have a policy that says that you should send audit logs to a log analytics workspace. If you are not doing this and you are non-compliant, then we use deploy if not exist together with a user assigned managed identity to create a remediation, and it's going to actually go and update the resource. And that's where you would use deploy if not exists. I'm going to leave the link to this in the description so you can take a look at it and read. It's good to have this bookmarked and handy because it's something that we use a lot within Azure Policy. Another common question, I promise we're going to get into some coding very soon, but a common question is, where do I find policies? Well, there's actually several places, but one of the places is here where we've already looked, like in the Azure portal. I can search for definitions, I can do some filtering, maybe I just want to see initiatives and not policies. I could also search for custom, or if I want to see built-in ones, and that is all fine and well. We do have this resource, which is Azure Advisor, and this is basically a library of a lot of the policies where you can see that we can look for built-in policies, much like we do in the portal. We do have something called policy ALZ. This is like the Azure landing zone policies, the think enterprise scale, but it's not called that anymore. It's now called Azure landing zone architectural concept. And you can do extra filtering. So I could go to initiatives, for example. I could select all to see all the initiatives. But here also at the type, I can choose I want to see only ALZ policies. Or we clear this and I only want to see AMBA. So AMBA is Azure Monitor Baseline Alerts. And so now we're more on the monitoring part of things. But these are two great resources where you can see it. Okay, but let's actually get into some Terraform. So I have a new project here, which I'm going to call Azure Terraform Policy Video. And in here, we're just going to go ahead and create a main.tf. We want to have a Terraform block and a required providers. Let's do Azure RM today. I feel like I've done a lot of AC API as of late, and it could be nice to see something else. So the source we want to say is HashiCorp, Azure RM. The version, I don't know what the latest version is, but I think a pretty new version is for 49.0. So let's do that. And I'm going to set up the provider block for Azure RM. Going to do that. And we have to say which subscription we're going to work with. And before I do that, I want to create a new file. So I'm going to say variables. I'm going to say dev tfvars. And I'm going to say Azure subscription ID. I'm going to put my subscription ID in there. We need a variables.tf. So we're going to create that. And we're going to say variable Azure subscription ID. The type is string. Description, my subscription ID. And then we can just say var Azure subscription. That's fine. I want to assign this subscription that we're going to work with at the subscription scope. And I know that it's going to want the subscription resource ID. And whenever we need that, I like to set up a local that I just say subscription resource ID. And I'm just gonna say subscriptions, and then we can string interpolate and say var Azure subscription ID. Now, whenever I need to say that, I can just say local.subscription resource ID. I'm gonna get the properly formatted resource ID for the subscription. We're gonna create a policy assignment, but we're gonna use a built-in policy. So let's actually go back to the one that's called allowed locations. If I click into this, at the end there, I have a GUID. This is the end of the policy definition ID that I want. So I can actually copy this. Then I can say data, Azure RM policy definition. And the name I can just say, assuming I would have more of these in the future, it would be good to differentiate them. So I could say allowed locations definition. And then all I have to do is just say name equals the GUID that I copied. Because this is a built-in policy definition, I can assume that it's going to exist, and I can assume that this is going to work. And then depending on what scope we want to assign it, there's a few different resources. So if I just type resource and do Azure RM, I can say subscription, and here you can see I have subscription policy assignments. If I did, for example, management group, you could see I have management group policy assignment. So if I wanted to assign it at that level, equally I could do like resource group, and I also have policy assignments. And finally we have resource policy assignment if the assignment should go at the resource level. But I want to do subscription, so I'm gonna say subscription policy assignments. And again, assuming I would have more of these, I would say allowed locations assignments. Okay, so now when we do the assignment, we have to give it a bunch of things. And the first thing we have to give it is a name, but we already have a data block with the policy definition. And if you remember, the policy definition contains a bunch of things for us. It contains the display name, for example. It has a name property as well. So we could most likely say data, Azure RM policy definition, allowed locations definition. And then when I do dot, I have a bunch of things that we can't see it, but I could do dot name, for example. Then I'm going to get the name from the policy definition itself. So I don't have to type much of that. I can just reuse what it's already existing. We have to give it a policy definition ID. And again, we can say data. Then we do have something called, not policy rule, but it should be, I guess it's just called ID actually. So we have the policy definition ID as well. Subscription ID, here's what I'm talking about, that it wants the subscription resource ID. So I could say subscription ID and then I just say local.subscription resource ID. And that's going to be pretty easy for me. And then we want to set some parameters. And this is where the fun stuff happens, because here we have to do something a little bit special. Because policies work with JSON, and when we assign the parameters, we have to actually convert the input values here from HCL to JSON. We can do this by saying JSON encode, and then I can open new square brackets in here, and now we can start working. So Copilot is already doing the thing, but if you remember back in the policy, the parameter was list of allowed locations. So I just input that here and we open new square brackets and we want to say that the value should equal something. And yeah, we could accept that because it's an array, basically in this case a list of strings. It should accept this. So we can say those locations as well as, let's say I want to have Sweden Central as well. I'm a little bit unsure if the formatting here is correct, but let's just try it. So I can open a new terminal and say Terraform init to initialize this. So that was successful. Let's run a Terraform plan and we'll say we want to use the variable file. So it's in variables and it's a dev.tfvar. So let's just run this. So initially this looks pretty correct. So we have a Azure RM subscription policy assignment. We call it allowed locations assignment. Maybe assignment is redundant actually. We could change that. However, I do wonder if we do have, yeah, we do have a display name. So we want to make sure we use the display name as well. I guess we also have a description, right? So we can say that we want to use the description as well. So we make sure we use everything we have. Let's run a new plan for this and see if the output looks a little bit better perhaps. So now we have a description and the allowed locations, and you can see I didn't type any of this out. This is dynamically grabbed from the definition, as well as a name and a list of allowed locations. So I guess let's just see what happens if we run apply, and we can also say auto approve. Okay, that took a little bit of time, almost 2 minutes, but we do have an apply that is complete. So back in the portal, if we go to assignments instead and we say allowed locations, yep, here it is. So if we click into it, we can see that here are the parameters or the values we set. So we set West Europe, North Europe, and Sweden Central. That looks good. All right, but that was how we have fetched a built-in policy that we've now assigned. What about creating our own custom policies? So the next scenario that we want to do with a custom policy, as you can see here, restrict which types of storage account replication configurations that can be used. When we're talking about replication with storage accounts, we're talking about if you are using like local redundancy, or if you have regional redundancy, or if you're just using like zonal redundancy, like there's a few different configurations you can have. And the idea is that we are in charge of a client that has a demand on us to make sure that we need to be super resilient. So we want to make sure that people can only create storage accounts where the redundancy requirements are fulfilled, basically. Maybe a little bit of a stupid scenario, but it's just to illustrate how we can create custom policies. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we actually follow the anatomy of an Azure policy. You remember how we have a definition, then we have an assignment, and then things actually happen. So the first thing that we need to do is that we need to create a definition. And it's fairly straightforward. We can say that we want to create a resource, and it's going to be a policy definition. The definition's name should be restrict storage redundancy, perhaps. Again, assuming I would have more policy definitions in the future. If I only have this one, it would be enough to just call it this, but we're gonna assume we will have more in the future. We have to set some basic things, so we wanna say that the name should be something like allowed storage replication types, perhaps. The policy type, you remembered when we looked at the example in the beginning, we saw built-in, but we are creating our own, so we have to set this to custom. I'm gonna copy in, to save on a little bit of time, the display name and the description that I had prepared. Some information that is more human friendly to read. And then we also have to say like what mode is this, and we want to use indexed for this one. So now we get into a few fun things. So we want to say, okay, what parameters do we have for this definition? And again, we have to make sure that we JSON encode this. So we're going to turn HCL into JSON. And here we actually want to use the effect parameter. So we want to make sure that we should be able to control if we just want to audit this or if we actually want to deny this, basically. So we can actually say that allowed values. We have a few different here. So, and this is this should be a list then. And I want to say that you can say audit, deny it happening, or just disabled. Disabled, basically, the policy is not going to bother. I guess we first should say that the type is a string actually, and we do have to use commas as it's going to be JSON, and we could say that we have a default value, and I feel like the default value should be audits, perhaps. It's just a little bit safer, and we should be consistent. So I'm not sure if I have to do this, but we can say type should be within quotes and default value should be within quotes. So those are the parameters that we care. Now we get to fiddle with the policy rule. Remember, this is basically the rule set that we were talking about, that if this is true and that is true, then do this, then deny, for example. So I'll say if, yeah, we do some more square brackets. We really like our square brackets. And then we want to say all of. So I want all of this to be true. And here we actually open this as a list. And this will be like a list of objects. So we open this further. And I want to say that the field, in this case for the resource, it should, or actually the field type equal. And I think casing is important, but we should say Microsoft storage accounts. Yep. So the type should equal Microsoft storage accounts. And then we have another object here. And then we have to do a little bit of a silly thing, but we should say not. And then we say field again, because we want to say what field are we looking at. And then we want to say Microsoft storage account SKU name. And then we say in. And I think it's a new object. Sorry, not an object, it's a list actually. And here I'm gonna enter all of my SKUs that I want. Format this. So basically, this may be super confusing right now, but we have to take it one by one. So the if statement says that all of this should be true. The type of resource should equal Microsoft storage accounts. So if it equals Microsoft storage accounts, but then we also say if the SKU name being set is not any of these, basically, then we want to do something. This is a new object. Then we want to say that the effect should be something. And what should it be? Well, it should be what has been set in the parameter called effect. So let's just recap, because this is a bit confusing. Even I get confused still reading this, even though I work with this almost daily. But basically, if we are processing a storage account and the SKU name does not equal or is not in any of these SKUs, then apply the effect. What is the effect? Well, that depends on what you set as the effect, because remember, we do have effect as a parameter. And I could set this to audit or deny or disabled. The default value, if I don't set anything, is going to be audit. So now then that we have a policy definition, it's about creating a new subscription policy assignment. And we can call this storage account replication restriction. Naming is hard. Name, let's just say allowed storage SKU. And then it's just about display name. So here we don't want to write all of this again. So we just want to say that we want to use not the data block. We use the Azure RM policy definition that we created. And then we say display name. Same for a subscription. We can use this again, local subscription resource ID. Then we have description. We'll say Azure RM policy definition description. We have to say policy definition ID. So we can say that as well. And that should also just be .id. So we can say parameters. We'll say JSON encode again. And I want to set the effect rights. And the name was effect. and I want to set a value, and I want to actually set the value deny, like this. So I'm going to actually overwrite what is the default value. Remember, the default value is audit, but allowed values does contain deny. So I can go ahead and set deny if I wish to. Okay, let's see what happens if we run a plan for this. So we get to create a policy assignment. The definition ID is going to be known after apply, obviously, because we haven't created it yet. And then we have the policy definition. So to me, this looks good. If we run apply, if it works first time, that would be insane. But let's see what happens. Okay, both of them were actually created successfully. That is almost a bit scary, actually. But let's copy the display name for the new definition back in the portal. If I search for my new definition, and there it is. So allow only storage accounts of zone or geo redundant replication. We have the policy rule we defined. We have the parameters we defined. Also take note that we didn't have to add any of the metadata. However, you perhaps should do that when you are working with a client, just to do things proper. But if we come out of there and go into assignments and we look for the same one, there it is. Allow only storage accounts of zone or geo redundant replication, and we can see that the effect is deny. So if I'm not creating with the proper configuration, I should get denied, right? So let's test it. So I'm gonna create in Limburg Tech Dev. I'm just gonna call this RG, this ain't gonna work. SA, this ain't gonna work. And redundancy. So by default, the redundancy is set to GRS, which remember is fine by policy. If I set this to locally redundant, allow only storage accounts of zone or geo redundant. So I can't do it. If I go back to, for example, zone redundant, then I'm fine. Now there is a lot more to cover with the Azure policy. Like, we only did this at pretty small scale right now, and policy as code at very small scale, just the one subscription. If you are interested in how we would do this in a larger environment, then be sure to let me know in the comments and like the video and subscribe to the channel, so when we do make that video, you don't miss it. And we're also going to cover other things like Azure attestations. What is that? We haven't touched exemptions. We have not done too much yet with like the deploy if not exist and how you pair that with a user assigned managed identity. All of that and much more will be available on the channel in the future, because policy is such a central thing to cloud engineering and to Azure in this case. And just being able to do this with Terraform, where you can version control everything, you can see changes happening, and you can list who made changes, it's super powerful. So yeah, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And thank you very much for watching. Have a great day. See you later. Bye bye.